Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this video. In this Patreon exclusive build series, I'm going to be building Citadel's XV95 Ghostkeel Battlesuit. Chris Bernique, a patron, sent this to me. Thank you so much, Chris, for sending this to me. I am very grateful for it. I had seen this model back around the time that I had made the switch to building sci-fi, towards the end of 2017. Maybe early 2018, I had seen Lincoln Wright's video about building this. I don't know if he had just released it or I just first encountered it there, but I really liked the way that it looked. It was just something about this stark black, white, gray, and this touch of red just really stood out to me. It's not a cheap kit, so again, thank you, Chris. And so kind of as an, I guess you'd say, an interim build, wanting to build something that looked like it, but was not quite as expensive, I built the XV86 Cold Star Battlesuit, which is, I mean, yeah, it's a different suit, but essentially it's a smaller version of this. And I really enjoyed that. And so when I received this, I was really excited about it because this is the one I've wanted to build all along. The kit itself is fairly typical of Citadel. You get 3 sprues with their very nicely cast parts. You can see the detail in their parts. They tend to exist, if you're not familiar with the Citadel kit or Warhammer in general, they're used for tabletop gaming, and everything about Warhammer is kind of over the top, so it translates right down into the kits. Panel lines are very heavy, very deep, lots of exaggerated edges and just bits and everything on it, but that is what makes, in my opinion, makes them just great fun to paint and detail and weather, because there's no fussing with the kit. There's no fussing with tiny panel lines and trying to mask off little bits. If you want to paint, you know, this section right here a different color, the panel lines just make it so easy to do it. It's definitely got its own aesthetic, but you can see it's just some great parts casting that's just very typical of Citadel. The kit also includes a base for the model, and that'll be fun to add some various textures, or, you know, rocks and things like that. I'm not sure how I'll do it. I'll probably forget it till the end and then do it at the last minute, and it'll look like a rush job. That's usually what happens. It's got a couple of these small bases for the 2 drones that come with it, which I'll talk about in a minute, and this set of decals. It's interesting the way Citadel does the decals. They put on decals for basically all of the Tau models. So when you get any of the Tau, the Tau kits, you have all of the decals for each of the kits on it. Like, I've used this XV86 Cold Star Battlesuit set before. It's just minimal decal stripes and these, whatever these markings are. I guess that's when they go to the grocery store, you can check out, you know, you just scan it with them. But it's a pretty good way to just print a whole bunch of decal sets and just put them in every box that says Tau on it, which is the faction that this model is part of. Citadel's instructions are always very clear. The parts numbering may not be. They can, when you look on the sprue, you can have part number 7 over here and part number 8 over here somewhere. So that can be a pain, but as far as assembly, it's just drop dead easy. There's nothing difficult about it, and you see that it just progresses through, and you've got a nice range of weapons options that you can stick on this guy. I notice it's even got a seated figure in it that if you want to leave that hatch open, you can. I'm not sure if I will, but time will tell. But you just go through like any model kit and follow the instructions. Generally what I do is I keep the major components separate for the early painting and weathering and chipping and things like that, and then only bring them together towards the end to finish it up. You see that once it's done, it stands about that big, and you can see in relation to the base there, it's going to be a little taller than the base is wide. So it's going to be a fairly substantial model. And you've got these two drones on the side, and I'm not sure what they do in the game other than, I mean, they're drones. And I guess they fly around with this guy and, you know, shoot things and have pew-pews on them and other sensors and whatever. But it's kind of fun painting and weathering these two little things too. And they go on this little stand, and I'll do you know, finish the base on it. The clear part is supposed to represent that, you know, of course it's flying. Although it would be neat to try and do something with magnets there. We'll see. But that's what he's going to look like when it's done, and I'm looking forward to really building this one. Now, I'm not going to build this on camera. That would bore me and bore you. But what I will do is, once it's built, if there's anything that needs to be pointed out about the construction that might be a problem or something to note, I'll definitely note that. One thing I do want to note right from the get-go is the sprue connectors on any Citadel kit are generally fairly heavy. Like here's a real good example on the foot here. That, I don't know if it'll focus in on it, but where it connects to the front of the foot, that's a fairly substantial connection point. I mean, it's easily 1/8 of an inch or bigger in terms of where it connects to the front of the toe. Now, luckily on that part, there's no detail. So once you clip it off, sanding that smooth won't be a problem. But you do have to be very careful when you're separating the parts to not create stress marks or pits in the part itself by snipping it off too close. I definitely do the 2-part cut on Citadel models, and I'm fairly, sometimes I'll cut it, I mean, as far as back here, because I want to definitely leave a good bit of the connection point sticking off so I can go back in afterwards and cut that. One thing to note, if you're wondering why to do that, when you make a cut, that initial cut, it can pinch and push and pull the plastic. And if you're doing it right up at the model, the surface of the model is what receives the brunt of the abuse. But if you snip away from it and leave that nub sticking up, then when you go in with some sharper cutters that can handle that narrower gate there, when you clip that, it slices it, especially if they're new and sharp, it slices it right along the surface of the model. And even then, I try to leave just a little bit and go in later with a file, either a metal file or a sanding stick, and clean it up, or with a hobby knife. But if you're building a Citadel kit, it's definitely something to pay attention to, as those sprue connection points are something to keep in mind every time you remove a part from the sprue. Okay, I've got everything assembled, and there are a few notes to go over that I think would be helpful if you're constructing this kit. First off, in the part 2 here, there's a cockpit right here, and the way it works is, this is the interior down in here, where there's a figure that comes with it that sits in there. This folds up to cover them, and then this folds down. And this piece right here, you have to leave this unglued so that it can still move, because you want to be able to push it into place, especially if you're going to glue it closed. Now, I've decided I'm going to glue this shut because the head has to go on top of here. And while you can raise this part up with the head in place, you can't get a whole lot of movement out of that once the head is glued in place, and you're not going to really be able to see much that's in there. So I decided that after showing this, I'm just going to glue all this down and not worry about the interior at all. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You'll have to make some decisions on how you want to handle that. Now, if if you're just going to use this and you could put magnets on it or somehow temporarily hold that on there, well, you could pop that off, pop it open, and somebody could look at the interior, and then you close it back up. But like I said, I'm going to glue that. Another section of note, when you're putting together this part back here, you put a left and right half together, and then these jet pods have a left and right half. What I recommend you do, the instructions show that you put this together and then stick these on them. I recommend you put these together, glue these two left and right halves together, but leave them off of this section right here. Then test fit this to this, and then see what angle you want these. Because if you just arbitrarily glue these in place on the other side, on either side of this before you put it here, you may end up with them pointing up or straight down or however. So give it a little bit of a test fit to see what angle you want to glue those at. A final note on the torso. On either side you have this part that glues in here, which is a gun mount. Now, I thought I test fitted and planned and all of that well, because I thought the gun that goes on top of this went on that edge. I don't know how I got that in my mind, but that's what I thought. Well, it turns out it goes on this edge, the long edge. So if I mount it the way it is now, this gun is going to be pointed up at a high angle, which I don't want. I want it pointed fairly straight over the shoulder. So if you're doing this, what I should have done was glued this small part right here into place, let that set, and then glue this part to the gun, painted those, and then later I could mount it at whatever angle I want. Now, I haven't decided how I'm going to resolve this. I may just glue it to that short part there and just leave it like it is. I'm considering cutting these two sections apart and getting it right. Unfortunately, I used Tamiya extra thin, and it's been sitting for about 3 days, so it's good and solid now. But be aware of that with these parts here, because if you don't, I thought I understood what the directions were saying, but apparently I did not. All right, the next thing I want to point out is assembly of the head. It's just two halves like that. Goes together really simply. There is this eyepiece that goes here. It can be popped in later, so I'm going to leave it out so that I can paint the two separate and get good sharp distinction between them, and then I'll just glue it in at the very end. On the leg assembly, there's a couple of parts. This is the lower part of the leg, and it shows this little BB-8 looking thing here that goes into a socket in this lower leg area. Now, they say don't glue it, but if you put it in there without any glue, the only thing it does is it can rotate, and it's where the foot joins on. And the foot you can position along that little ball any way you want when you're assembling it. So I found it didn't matter that I could tell that whether I got any glue on here, because you can glue the foot on any way you want. Because here's the foot, and it goes in this ball, and whether this ball rotates or not, you can glue the foot however you want. So I didn't get too worried about whether that rotated or not. This one doesn't, the other one does. Also, it shows you that you'll want to put the leg together like this here, but you can you have some leeway with the angles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait to glue those together until much later in the process so that I can decide how I want this standing on its base. So, you know, you could glue it together like the instructions say right off the bat, but I'm going to wait a little bit and see how I want to position it. Also, there's some armor pieces that go on the legs. Because this internal frame is going to be black and the armor pieces are going to be white, I'm going to leave those off and add those later, so those are left off also. The rest of the build is fairly straightforward. No additional real notes to put there. Just make sure you're following which parts go where, because there's a few places that if you cut the parts off, they look alike, but the orientation might be a little different. So that can cause some confusion. So I literally did it step by step and tried to make sure that I got the orientation right. There's various weapons that you can use on this, so you'll need to make some choices, but those are very apparent. And the paths there are easy to follow. And then pretty quickly you get to putting together the waist, putting on the legs, putting on the arms and the torso, and you'll have your finished model. The way I'm going to leave mine broken down is upper torso, the guns separate, the arms separate from the arm armor, the legs separate from the leg armor, and I'll paint all those, and only when I'm getting ready to start weathering it will I bring it all together. Alright, you can see I have everything in my sorting trays, and it's time to get this guy primed up. The airbrush I normally use for priming is not working right now, so I mounted up the larger parts on some alligator clamps and stuck the smaller parts down onto some masking tape and simply used Tamiya rattle can primer to get everything primed up. I just made a few light passes, letting it dry between applications, and within a fairly short time I had everything primed up and ready for the next steps. Alright, with everything primed, it's time to start getting the base colors on. And for this, I'm going to start with a white color. Now, on camera, as I'm looking at the camera right now, it appears much more gray than it actually is in my palette. What I did was I mixed 3 parts cold white with 1 part sky gray. While this is supposed to be a white model, I want to leave some room for some highlights using pure white, so using something that's just a touch of gray with it really helps. The gray also helps with brush painting. I've found that if I try to go in just with pure white, it can be difficult to get a good finish in just a few coats with white paint, but with adding just a little bit of gray to it, it seems to help it spread a little better. I also put in 2 drops of airbrush thinner and 1 drop of airbrush flow improver. Now, because I'm going to be coming back later and painting a lot of these parts with black and gray, I'm going to go in with the white first and just lay down the first coat here. This first coat is going to be very streaky, and you're going to see a lot of the primer through it, but that's okay because it sounds better to say that in a video. No, sometimes I wonder if people do things in videos and they get halfway through it and they go, well, this isn't working out, so let me on the fly make up something that sounds like it works. No, this actually, doing it this way is going to be very brush strokey and have a lot of gray in it for the first coat. But after 2 or 3 follow-on coats, you should get a nice almost white finish that, while it may have just a slight bit of texture to the feel, it helps to be in focus, John, it should also look fairly smooth. Now, it's not going to be as smooth as an airbrush unless you're just really accomplished at brush painting, or a few times I've gotten really lucky that it just seemed to be a combination of paint and thinning and, like I said, just I think pure luck sometimes getting it done. But all I'm doing is getting just a little bit of paint on the brush. I'm not, you know, blobbing it on there. And I'm spreading it around. I'm generally taking the strokes in one direction so that I don't know if this is a real thing, but it is in my head. I think the pigments, when you do the strokes in one direction, I think the pigments line up better. Like I said, that may not be an actual thing. I may just be perceiving something just based on false assumptions. Again, apologies for getting off camera. I'm focusing more on the painted thing than on the camera. But it really helps when you're brush painting to keep the strokes aligned, especially on this first coat. And like I said, it's going to look fairly streaky. If you stop here, it's not going to be great looking. Let me show you, I did some work yesterday. Let me show you how it is in progress. This shows, that's unpainted right there. This part here is unpainted. This part here has one coat. This has two coats. You're still seeing a few little brush strokes of the primer coming through because I applied the second coat. I probably applied it too soon after putting on the first coat. I should have given the first coat a little more time to dry so that it didn't. Acrylics can reactivate if they're applied, you know, if you apply a second coat in a fairly short time after the first coat. But you can see the difference that it makes between this and this. With weathering and all the other things that are going to go over it, except for a few touch-up places, this will be okay. Now, another thing you may be asking yourself, and you can go ahead and ask yourself, why am I not airbrushing this? Well, it would be quicker, and it would give me a much better coverage. But I like the look that brush painting gives. I think it starts a depth of finish that is not so flat. Later steps will of course cover up some of the strokes. Steps such as weathering and adding additional colors and all of those, you know, those things that are going to come later. But I just like the process of brush painting sometimes. I find that it's just a very peaceful thing to do. I don't, right now at this particular point in the history of our world, it's a somewhat stressful time for many people, and I'm among those. So I find that that doing this just kind of lets me drift away. You know, I don't mean that you just completely forget everything, but you get focused on this and it kind of pushes things out of mind and gives you just a brief respite from all that's going on. And so I decided that I would just take a little more time and brush paint this guy and enjoy the process. Sometimes while airbrushing may give a better finish overall, I think it can rob the process of some of the joy. At least that's my philosophy. And it's a great way to take up about 3 minutes on video. So anyway, I'll just continue painting these parts and get in these coats of the white paint, the almost white paint, and then I will move on to painting some gray. While I wait for some of that white paint to dry, or the off-white paint, I'm going to start painting some gray detail where the paint has dried enough for me to do that. Now, if you're Citadel doesn't, a lot of model kits, they show you, you know, paint this color here, paint this color there. Citadel tends to just show you the box art and give you a list of paints and say, figure it out yourself. You'll notice that there's a lot of little gray accents all over the model. So I'm going to use Vallejo Model Color Neutral Gray for that. And all I do is put equal parts paint and thinner in my palette, and I'm just going to go through and paint these areas that are gray. Now, I don't get too worried about staying in the lines perfectly. While I try to, if I get outside of it a little bit, I don't worry, because later on I'm going to be adding some chipping to the gray areas with white and to the white areas with gray. So if anything gets outside of the lines, as long as it's not too egregious, you can just call it chipping and keep going with it. And not that you can't figure out how to paint gray, but just for the sake of documenting it, this is a part that's already dried up enough to do it. And all I want to do is go in and put in that gray, and I'm going to lay this down a little heavier than I did for the white. A very wet coat, a little heavier, and should be able to get this in one pass. You know what? I'm using the wrong doggone brush. I was trying to say, why can't I get up to that edge? It's because I'm using my big fat brush and not this more pointy brush. I may have gotten my paint a little too thin because it's pushing it around a bit. But that's okay. I'll go back in and just do that wet coat to get that in there. If you are going to do a wet coat where it's visibly wet, you're not necessarily trying to be thin with it, make sure that it's reasonably, you want it to be reasonably wet, because it will self-level if there's enough paint there to level. You know, I was talking with a friend, he was talking about having trouble with spraying on Future as a clear coat, and he said, I just can't get it to self-level. I said, do you do mist coats? He said, yeah. I said, well, that's the problem. There's not enough self there to level. So, same way with this. You can get away with a fairly wet coat that will cover in essentially one pass, maybe two with just a little touch-up, but you have to get it wet enough so that there's some there to level out. And I'll just set that aside and let it dry and continue painting the white and the gray. And I do this because there's a lot of white and there's a lot of gray. I'll continue to do this process. I'll do one part maybe in its second coat of white, another part may be beginning in gray, another side of one part may be getting the first coat of white. So when you're brush painting like this, sometimes you know, organizing things and doing it in stages just helps you keep rolling along. One of the things I really like about these towel suits is they tend to, at least in this scheme, they tend to paint one part red, and it's usually the head. And I kind of like that all black, white, and gray look, but with this one bright splash of color. For this one, I'm going to be using Citadel's Mephiston Red, which is their recommended color. It's the first time I've used this color. I've used a Vallejo equivalent before, but this is the first time I've used their color. It's a darker red. I wouldn't call it a dark red, you know, kind of like I normally use Citadel's gory red from their game color line for stuff like this. And it's not quite as purpley and as dark as that is. And as this is going on, and like I said, this is my first time using this, I like this color. I liked that gory red, but man, this color is really popping. I hope the camera's translating this pretty well. Man, I like this color. And it goes on fairly smooth. I just put a drop of it in my palette, and I put in just the barest amount of water. Just a little brushful, like Duncan used to show on the Games Workshop videos. And I guess he still does if you watch him over and over. But I really like this color. And it gives it just, I think it makes the whole suit stand out, because there's so little color to it that when there's such a bright and contrasty element right in the middle of it, I think it really, really makes this thing look distinguished, you know, outstanding. You can't help but notice it. And so yeah, this is what really draws me to these towel suits, is this single bright splash of color that just stands out. A big chunk of this model is the black inner frame parts. For this, I'm going to use Vallejo Model Color Black Gray. Just as with the white, I like to use something less than full-on black for this, because that gives some space, some color space, I guess you'd say, that allows for additional shadow to be added. Now granted, you don't need a lot of shadow in the black area. Where you're going to make your hay anytime you're painting black is in the highlights, not in the shadow. But it is nice to have the option of having some places that are just a little darker, and perhaps even on camera. And that just gives you some flexibility with working with black. Because if you go in, if you think, okay, I'm going to go in with flat black across the whole thing, and then I'm going to use very dark grays to bring up highlights all the way up to, you know, maybe you go as high as neutral gray for your highlights, or even more. You tend to spend a lot of time painting over flat black rather than just adding in highlights and shadow. So I find that hitting, I don't know that I would call this the mid-tone, but I think if you think of this as one step down from the mid-tone, it gives you a good place to start with your, I guess you'd say, your attack plan for how you're going to handle the black. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go in and do the larger areas with this larger brush. And then I'm going to get in. You can see I'd already painted some of it on there to get around that white area. And I use a finer brush for that so that I don't get too much onto the white. Now, if you do get onto the white, if you get some of this black paint onto the white, what I normally do is, if it's soon enough, if I notice it quick enough, I grab an extra brush and I dab it in water, and I try and dab up some of that paint. Now, you have to be careful not to smear it around. You can end up doing more harm than good sometimes if you're not careful. But what I'll do is dab up any that I can, and if I can't dab it up, if I don't notice it, or if it's, you know, in a place that might be a little difficult to get at, or I'm worried about smearing it around, I'll just leave it, let it dry, of course. And then once it's dry, I'll actually use, if I can get to it, I'll actually use a little bit of abrasive, maybe a sanding stick, to just lightly buff that down so that it doesn't create additional texture on top of the white, so that it stands up, and very gently buff it down to the white. And then I'll paint over it with sky gray, which covers the black much better than white will. And then once the sky gray is dried, then I go in with whatever my white color is, and paint that. And if I can't get to where I can buff it down, if it's just too difficult to get at even for that, then I'll just paint over it with sky gray and then the white. So doing broad brush stroke work first, and then going back in with a fine brush to get up to the edges and up to the details, I think is the way that has worked the best for me in painting something like this. So I will continue to paint black onto this part, and there's still quite a few other parts that have black that need to be added. So let me get to that. All right, well, as you can see, I've got a lot of things painted white and gray and black. I still have probably a couple of more hours of painting ahead of me, just to like getting up to the edges of things with the black and the white, or touching up white here or there, touching up some gray here or there, because I want to start off with a fairly clean base. But I think you've seen through this video, one, what a fun and great kit this is. And again, thanks to patron Chris Bernique for giving this to me. I'm just so grateful for it. I really am enjoying this. But this is a really cool kit that just has so many angles and details and things to paint. You know, quite often we tend to look at a model and we say, well, that one's kind of expensive, and so I'm not going to build that one. And I get it. I mean, if you know, I didn't buy this because it was kind of expensive, although I think eventually I would have, because I really wanted to build it. But sometimes I think it helps to think of the equation in terms of number of hours you enjoy building the model versus the cost. Because, you know, when you get down to it, you might spend as much time building a more expensive model, but that has more details, as you would 2 or 3 cheaper kits. You know, and so when you start thinking about it in terms of, you know, dollars per hour of fun, sometimes that tips the scale towards some of these more expensive kits. I know when I built Citadel's Valkyrie dropship model, that one, while it was an expensive model, it had I enjoyed that so much that I felt it was worth every penny that I paid for it. So, you know, if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. I've been there. I'm there. I get that. But sometimes if you think, okay, instead of buying these 2 or 3 cheaper models, let me save up a little bit and get this one I really want, you may get more fun out of that one than you would get out of those 3. Anyway, just something to think about. But I'm going to continue painting the base colors on here, and I'll pick up in the next video where that leaves off and get into decaling and panel lining and maybe some further detailing, and then on to the weathering. So expect 2 or 3, certainly I think it'll go into 3 parts for this series. But thank you so much for being a patron. Thank you for making what I do possible, because you really do. And I am most grateful. My family and I are so very grateful, because it allows us to be able to do the things we need to do with the family household budget, and not have the hobby take such a deep bite out of that. So I am so very grateful, and thank you for your encouragement and your notes that you send me and things like that. I'm always love to hear from folks, so please don't ever hesitate to message me or leave a comment or something like that. I'm always grateful to hear from people. And I hope you're doing well at this time. And remember, I always say, if you're not having fun in this hobby, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.